Hey guys, so we've got to a really exciting bit where Sophie is waiting on the Queen's windowsill, waiting to see if she'll get noticed. And the Queen is still talking to her maid about the dream that she had. I don't know how giants got into it. That was rubbish. Shall I draw the curtains, Mum, and shall we all feel better? It's a lovely day. Please do. With a swish, the great curtains were pulled aside. The maid screamed. Sophie froze to the window ledge. The Queen, sitting up in her bed with the Times on her lap, glanced up sharply. Now it was her turn to freeze. She didn't scream as the maid had done. Queens are too self-controlled for that. She simply sat there staring, wide-eyed and white-faced, at the small girl who was perched on her window sill in a nightie. Sophie was petrified. Curiously enough, the Queen looked petrified too. One would have expected her to look surprised, as you or I would have done had we discovered a small girl sitting on our windowsill first thing in the morning. But the Queen didn't look surprised. She looked genuinely frightened. The maid, a middle-aged woman with a funny cap on the top of her head, was the first to recover. What in the name of heaven do you think you're doing in here? She shouted angrily to Sophie. Sophie looked beseechingly towards the Queen for help. The Queen was still staring at Sophie. Gaping at her would be more accurate. Her mouth was slightly open, her eyes were round and wide as two saucers, and the whole of that famous, rather lovely face was filled with disbelief. Now listen here, young lady, how on earth did you get into this room? The maid shouted furiously. I don't believe it, the Queen was murmuring. I simply don't believe it. I'll take her out, ma'am, at once, the maid was saying. No, Mary, no, don't do that. The Queen spoke so sharply that the maid was quite taken aback. She turned and stared at the Queen. What on earth had come over her? It looked as though she was in a state of shock. Are you all right, ma'am? The maid was saying. When the Queen spoke again, it was in a strange, strangled sort of whisper. Tell me, Mary, she said, tell me quite truthfully, is there really a little girl sitting on my windowsill, or am I dreaming? She is sitting there all right, ma'am, as clear as daylight, but heaven only knows how she got there. Your Majesty is certainly not dreaming it this time. But that's exactly what I did dream, the Queen cried out. I dreamed that as well. I dreamed there would be a little girl sitting on my windowsill in her nightie and she would talk to me. The maid, with her hands clasped across her starched white bosom, was staring at her mistress with a look of absolute disbelief on her face. The situation was getting beyond her. She was lost. She had not been trained to cope with this kind of madness. Are you real? The Queen said to Sophie. Yes, Your Majesty, Sophie murmured. What is your name? Sophie, Your Majesty. And how did you get up onto my windowsill? No, don't answer that. Hang on a moment. I dreamed that part of it too. I dreamed that a giant put you there. He did, Your Majesty, Sophie said. The maid gave a howl of anguish and clasped her hands over her face. Control yourself, Mary, the Queen said sharply. Then to Sophie she said, You're not serious about the giant, are you? Oh yes, Your Majesty. He's out there in the garden right now. Is he indeed? The Queen said. The sheer absurdity of it all was helping her to regain her composure. So he's in the garden, is he? She said, smiling a little. He is a good giant, Your Majesty, Sophie said. You need not be frightened of him. I'm delighted to hear it, said the Queen, still smiling. He's my best friend, Your Majesty. How nice, the Queen said. He's a lovely giant, Your Majesty. I'm quite sure he is, the Queen said. But why have you and this giant come to see me? I think you've dreamed that part of it too, Your Majesty, Sophie said calmly. That pulled the Queen up short. It took the smile right off her face. She certainly had dreamed that part of it. She was remembering now how, at the end of her dream, it had said that a little girl and a big friendly giant would come and show her how to find the 9 horrible man-eating giants. But be careful, the Queen told herself. Keep very calm, because this is surely not very far from the place where madness begins. You did dream that, didn't you, Your Majesty? Sophie said. The maid was out of it now. She just stood there goggling. Yes, the Queen murmured. Yes, now you come to mention it, I did. But how do you know what I dreamed? Oh, that's a long story, Your Majesty, Sophie said. Would you like me to call the big friendly giant? The Queen looked at the child. The child looked straight back at the Queen, her face open and quite serious. The Queen simply didn't know what to make of it. Was someone pulling her leg, she wondered. Shall I call him for you? Sophie went on. You'll like him very much. The Queen took a deep breath. She was glad no one except her faithful old Mary was here to see what was going on. Very well, she said. You may call your giant. No, wait a moment. Mary, pull yourself together and give me my dressing gown and slippers. The maid did as she was told. The Queen got out of bed and put on a pale pink dressing gown and slippers. You may call him now, the Queen said. Sophie turned her head towards the garden and called out, BFG, Her Majesty the Queen would like to see you. The Queen crossed over to the window and stood beside Sophie. Come down off that ledge, she said. You're going to fall backward at any moment. Sophie jumped down into the room and stood beside the Queen at the open window. Mary, the maid, stood behind them. Her hands were now planted firmly on her hips, and there was a look on her face which seemed to say, I want no part of this fiasco. I don't see any giant, the Queen said. Please wait, Sophie said. Shall I take her away now, ma'am? The maid said. Take her downstairs and give her some breakfast, the Queen said. Just then there was a rustle in the bushes beside the lake. Then out he came. 24 feet tall, wearing his black cloak with the grace of a nobleman, still carrying his long trumpet in one hand, he strode magnificently across the palace lawn towards the window. The maid screamed. The Queen gasped. Sophie waved. The BFG took his time. He was very dignified in his approach. When he was close to the window where the three of them were standing, he stopped and made a slow, graceful bow. His head, after he straightened up again, was almost exactly level with the watchers at the window. Your Majesty, he said, I is your humbug servant. He bowed again. Considering she was meeting a giant for the first time in her life, the Queen remained astonishingly self-composed. We are very pleased to meet you, she said. Down below, a gardener was coming across the lawn with a wheelbarrow. He caught sight of the BFG's legs over to his left. His gaze travelled slowly upwards along the entire height of his enormous body. He gripped the handles of the wheelbarrow. He swayed. He tottered. Then he kneeled over on the grass in a dead faint. Nobody noticed him. Oh, Magister, cried the BFG. Oh, Queen, oh, Monarcher, oh, Golden Sovereign, oh, ruler of straight lines, oh, Sultana. I is coming here with my little friend Sophie to give you a... The BFG hesitated, searching for the word. To give me what? The Queen said. Assistance, the BFG said, beaming. The Queen looked puzzled. He sometimes speaks a bit funny, Your Majesty, Sophie said. He never went to school. Then we must send him to school, the Queen said. We have some very good schools in this country. I has great secrets to tell, Your Magister, the BFG said. I should be delighted to hear them, the Queen said, but not in my dressing gown. Shall you wish to get dressed, ma'am? The maid said. Have either of you had breakfast? The Queen said. Oh, could we? Sophie cried. Oh, please. I haven't eaten a thing since yesterday. I was about to have mine, the Queen said, but Mary dropped it. It's a picture of them at the window. The maid gulped. I imagine we have more food in the palace, the Queen said, speaking to the BFG. Perhaps you and your little friend would care to join me. Will it be repulsant snarl-scumbers, Magister? The BFG asked. Will it be what? The Queen said. Stinky snarl-scumbers, the BFG said. What is he talking about? The Queen said. It sounds like a rude word to me. She turned to the maid and said, Mary, ask them to serve breakfast for 3 in the... I think it had better be the ballroom. That has the highest ceiling. To the BFG, she said, I'm afraid you will have to go through the door on your hands and knees. I shall send someone to show you the way. The BFG reached up and lifted Sophie out of the window. You and I is leaving Her Majesty alone to get dressed, he said. No, leave the little girl here with me, the Queen said. We'll have to find something for her to put on. She can't have breakfast in her nightie. The BFG returned Sophie to the bedroom. Can we have sausages, Your Majesty? Sophie said, and bacon and fried eggs. I think that might be managed, the Queen answered, smiling. Just you wait till you taste it, Sophie said to the BFG. No more snoscumbers from now on. The Royal Breakfast. There was a frantic scurry among the palace servants when orders were received from the Queen that a 24-foot giant must be seated with Her Majesty in the great ballroom within the next half hour. The butler, an imposing personage named Mr. Tibbs, was in supreme command of all the palace servants, and he did the best he could in the short time available. A man does not rise to become the Queen's butler unless he is gifted with extraordinary ingenuity, adaptability, versatility, dexterity, cunning, sophistication, sagacity, discretion, and a host of other talents that neither you nor I possess. Mr. Tibbs had them all. He was in the butler's pantry sipping an early morning glass of light ale when the order reached him. In a split second, he had made the following calculations in his head. If a normal 6-foot man requires a 3-foot high table to eat off, a 24-foot giant will require a 12-foot high table. And if a 6-foot man requires a chair with a 2-foot high seat, a 24-foot giant will require a chair with an 8-foot high seat. Everything, Mr. Tibbs told himself, must be multiplied by 4. 2 breakfast eggs must become 8. 4 rashers of bacon must become 16. 3 pieces of toast must become 12, and so on. These calculations about food were immediately passed on to Monsieur Papillon, the royal chef. Mr. Tibbs skimmed into the ballroom. Butlers don't walk, they skim over the ground, followed by a whole army of footmen. The footmen all wore knee breeches, and every one of them displayed beautifully rounded calves and ankles. There's no way you can become a royal footman unless you have a well-turned ankle. It's the first thing they look at when you're interviewed. Push the grand piano into the centre of the room, Mr. Tibbs whispered. Butlers never raised their voices above the softest whisper. 4 footmen moved the piano. Now fetch a large chest of drawers and put it on top of the piano, Mr. Tibbs whispered. 3 other footmen fetched a very fine Chippendale mahogany chest of drawers and placed it on top of the piano. That will be his chair, Mr. Tibbs whispered. It is exactly 8 feet off the ground. Now we shall make a table upon which this gentleman may eat his breakfast in comfort. Fetch me 4 very tall grandfather clocks. There are plenty of them around the palace. Let each clock be 12 feet high. 16 footmen spread out around the palace to find the clocks. They were not easy to carry and required 4 footmen to each one. Place the 4 clocks in a rectangle 8 feet by 4 along the grand piano, Mr. Tibbs whispered. The footman did so. Now fetch me the young prince's ping-pong table, Mr. Tibbs whispered. The ping-pong table was carried in. Unscrew its legs and take them away, Mr. Tibbs whispered. This was done. Now place the ping-pong table on top of the 4 grandfather clocks, Mr. Tibbs whispered. To manage this, the footman had to stand on step-ladders. Mr. Tibbs stood back to survey the new furniture. None of it is in the classic style, he whispered, but it will have to do. He gave orders that a damask tablecloth should be draped over the ping-pong table, and in the end it looked really quite elegant after all. At this point Mr. Tibbs was seen to hesitate. The footmen all stared at him aghast. Butlers never hesitate, not even when they're faced with the most impossible problems. It's their job to be totally decisive at all times. Knives and forks and spoons, Mr. Tibbs was heard to mutter. Our cutlery will be like little pins in his hands. But Mr. Tibbs didn't hesitate for long. Tell the head gardener, he whispered, that I require immediately a brand new unused garden fork and also a spade. And for a knife we shall use the great sword hanging on the wall in the morning room. But clean the sword well first. It was last used to cut off the head of King Charles I, and there may still be a little dried blood on the blade. When all this had been accomplished, Mr. Tibbs stood near the centre of the ballroom, casting his expert butler's eye over the scene. Had he forgotten anything? He certainly had. What about a coffee cup for the large gentleman? Fetch me, he whispered, the biggest jug you can find in the kitchen. A splendid 1-gallon porcelain water jug was brought in and placed on the giant's table beside the garden fork and the garden spade and the giant's sword. So much for the giant. Mr. Tibbs then had the footman move a small delicate table and 2 chairs alongside the giant's table. This was for the Queen and Sophie. The fact that the giant's table and chair towered far above the smaller table simply could not be helped. All these arrangements were only just completed when the Queen, now fully dressed in a trim skirt and cashmere cardigan, entered the ballroom holding Sophie by the hand. A pretty blue dress that had once belonged to one of the princesses had been found for Sophie, and to make her look prettier still, the Queen had picked up a superb sapphire brooch from her dressing table and had pinned it on the left side of Sophie's chest. The big friendly giant followed behind them, but he had an awful job getting through the door. He had to squeeze himself through on his hands and knees, with 2 footmen pushing him from behind and 2 pulling from the front. But he got through in the end. He had removed his black cloak and got rid of his trumpet, and was now wearing his ordinary simple clothes. As he walked across the ballroom, he had to stoop quite a lot to avoid hitting the ceiling. Because of this, he failed to notice an enormous crystal chandelier. Crash! Went his head right into the chandelier. A shower of glass fell upon the poor BFG. Gung-hums and barkwinkles, he cried. What was that? It was Louis XV, the Queen said, looking slightly put out. He's never been in the house before, Sophie said. Mr. Tibbs scowled. He directed 4 footmen to clear up the mess. Then, with a disdainful little wave of the hand, he indicated to the giant that he should seat himself on top of the chest of drawers on top of the grand piano. What a fizz-whizzing flush-bunking seat, cried the BFG. Oh, he's going to be buggers a snug in a rug up here. Does he always speak like that? The Queen asked. Quite often, Sophie said. He gets tangled up with his words. The BFG sat down on the chest of drawers piano and gazed in wonder around the great ballroom. By gumdrops, he cried. What a spliffling whopsy room we is in. It is so gigantuous I is needing binoculars and telescopes to see what is going on at the other end. Footmen arrived carrying silver trays with fried eggs, bacon, sausages and fried potatoes. At this point, Mr. Tibbs suddenly realised that in order to serve the BFG at his 12-foot-high grandfather clock table, he would have to climb to the top of one of the tall step-ladders. What's more, he must do it balancing a huge warm plate on the palm of one hand and holding a gigantic silver coffee pot in the other. A normal man would have flinched at the thought of it, but good butlers never flinch. Up he went, up and up and up, while the Queen and Sophie watched him with great interest. It's possible they were both secretly hoping he would lose his balance and go crashing to the floor, but good butlers never crash. At the top of the ladder, Mr. Tibbs, balancing like an acrobat, poured the BFG's coffee and placed the enormous plate before him. On the plate there were 8 eggs, 12 sausages, 16 rashers of bacon and a heap of fried potatoes. What is this, please, your Magister? The BFG asked, peering down at the Queen. He's never eaten anything except snosgumbers before in his life, Sophie explained. They taste revolting. They don't seem to have started his growth, the Queen said. The BFG grabbed the garden spade and scooped up all the eggs, sausages, bacon and potatoes in one go and shovelled them into his enormous mouth. By goggles, he cried, this stuffer's making snosgumbers taste like swallop. The Queen glanced up, frowning. Mr. Tibbs looked down at his toes and his lips moved in silent prayer. That was only one titchy little bite, the BFG said. Is you having any more of this delunctious grubble in your cupboard, Magister? Tibbs, the Queen said, showing true regal hospitality, fetch the gentleman another dozen fried eggs and a dozen sausages. Mr. Tibbs swam out of the room, muttering unspeakable words to himself and wiping his brow with a white handkerchief. The BFG lifted the huge jug and took a swallow. Oh, he cried, blowing a mouthful across the ballroom. Please, what is this horrible swig pill he's drinking, Magister? It's coffee, the Queen told him, freshly roasted. It's filthsome, the BFG cried out. Where's the frog skull? The what? The Queen asked. Delumptious fizzy frog scuttle, the BFG answered. Everyone must be drinking frog scuttle with breakfast, Magister. Then we can all be whiz-popping happily together afterwards. What does he mean? The Queen said, frowning at Sophie. What is whiz-popping? Sophie kept a very straight face. BFG, he said, There's no frobscottle here, and whisk-popping is strictly forbidden. What? Cried the BFG. No frobscottle? No whisk-popping? No glumptious music? No boom, boom, boom? Absolutely not, Sophie told him firmly. If he wants to sing, please don't stop him, the Queen said. He doesn't want to sing, Sophie said. He said he wants to make music, the Queen went on. Shall I send for a violin? No, Your Majesty, Sophie said. He's only joking. A sly little smile crossed the BFG's face. Listen, he said, peering down at Sophie. If they isn't having any frobscottle here in the palace, I can still go whisk-popping perfectly well without it if I is trying hard enough. No, cried Sophie, don't. You're not to. I beg you. Music is very good for digestion, the Queen said. When I'm up in Scotland, they play the bagpipes outside the window while I'm eating. Do play something. I has Her Majesty's permission, cried the BFG, and all at once he let fly with a whisk-popper that sounded as though a bomb had exploded in the room. The Queen jumped. Whoopee! Shouted the BFG. That is better than baglepipes, is it not, Magister? It took the Queen a few seconds to get over the shock. I prefer the bagpipes, she said, but she couldn't stop herself smiling. Do you think he impressed the Queen? I think she secretly quite likes BFG. All right, we'll leave it there today, guys. Have a lovely evening. Happy Easter. Take care.